The middle game is where everything feels confusing, but this three-step system showed me my opponent's weaknesses I was completely ignoring, and once you see them, you can actually start forcing wins. So yeah, no messing around, I'm Philip, let's jump right in. So I want to start by talking about pawn structure. Anytime a pawn pushes forward, it stops controlling the squares next to it, and that creates weaknesses. And those squares can turn into really nice outposts for our pieces later on. For example, the f3 square is a very weak square because it can't be defended by pawns anymore. Since both pawns next to it have already advanced, that square ends up being pretty vulnerable. Another weak square we can look at is h3. The pawn pushed, and now the king is kind of stuck having to defend that square. So both of these points are already vulnerable, especially around the king, and that can cause a lot of problems in the position. Another target in white's pawn structure is the pawn on e4. That pawn is being attacked by the knight on g5, and that basically leaves the rook on e1 stuck defending. So you can already tell this knight on g5 is really well placed, hitting a bunch of weak points in white's position. And there's one more square that really stands out, d3. The same idea shows up again here. The e-pawn and the c-pawn advance forward, and that leaves d3 pretty vulnerable. Now, it might not be super obvious yet how to actually use d3. You might look at it and think, okay, but what am I supposed to do with this square? And that's fine. The point is, this gives you ideas in the position. Now you already know that at some point, you can look for ways to exploit these weaknesses in white's position. So this is the first step: you analyze the pawn structure. Always keep in mind that it tells you a lot about the position. But there's a second step that helps even more and gives you extra ideas, and that's evaluating your pieces, especially the ones that aren't placed very well. For example, if you look at the knight on g5, that's a really well-placed piece. That knight is already hitting the weak points in the position, and if you look at the rook on d8, it's controlling the only open file, so that piece is also very well placed. But the black queen isn't nearly as active. It's basically just defending the rook on d8 and the pawn on b7. So the idea naturally comes up to improve the queen, to look for a more active square. And this is where you start to see a really important pattern: how to improve your pieces when they're badly placed, and how to find more active setups for them. As you go through that process, concrete ideas start to show up, like bringing the queen to d7. From there, it attacks the weak point on h3, and at the same time puts pressure on the d3 square. And notice something important here. We're talking about attacking empty squares, not just pieces. Beginner players often ignore square control and focus only on direct threats against the opponent's pieces. So when you put pawn structure together with piece evaluation, you already start getting ideas for moves. And like I said before, a lot of the time, those two steps alone are enough to help you make the right decision. But there's a third step that I think is the most important one, and that's understanding what your opponent wants to do. This really matters because many times you do see the weak squares, the weaknesses, your own ideas, but you completely miss your opponent's plan, and that's why this step is so important. So the key question here is, what does white want to do right now? If it were their move, what would they play? And there's a very clear threat here: pawn to h4, kicking the strong knight on g5. So if black doesn't do something right away, if you play a passive move in this position, white is going to play pawn to h4. That knight gets pushed back to a worse square and can't really make use of those weaknesses anymore. And what that means is simple: you have one move, one window to take advantage of this. Otherwise, pawn to h4 is coming on the very next move. When you combine these three elements, you suddenly have a lot of ideas in the position. And that's how you arrive at the best plan, by combining pawn structure, piece activity, and your opponent's plan to find the right move. And the best move here is queen to d7. Just look at how everything clicks into place. With this move, we're already threatening queen to h3. So white doesn't have time to play h4 because that runs straight into mate in 2. Queen to h3 followed by knight to f3. On top of that, queen to d7 hits the weakness on h3, puts pressure on the weakness on d3, and at the same time improves the queen itself. Everything starts to make sense. So to defend h3, white went g4. Yeah, it's an unfortunate move, but there really weren't many options, because if white tries rook to h1 to defend h3, you just win the pawn on e4. And there's an even stronger idea there, which is queen to d3, with the plan of taking on e4 with the queen, and that's when mating themes really start to show up in the position. So after g4, as you already know, every time a pawn pushes forward, it creates new weaknesses. Now the f4 square is weak as well, and a move like knight to e6 already gives black a very large advantage. But here, black found an even stronger move, h5, sacrificing a pawn. This sacrifice already threatens pawn takes g4, and you can't take on h5 because that runs straight into mate in 2, and now a lot of weaknesses start showing up in white's position. If they try f3 to stop the attack, the king becomes extremely vulnerable. Queen to d3 already hits the knight and threatens queen to c2, breaking into the second rank. White played knight to e3, trying to hold things together. We respond with queen to d3, stepping right into the weak square, and now everything lines up. We're attacking the knight and threatening queen takes e4. White went pawn to h4, attacking the knight, but at this point, the position is already completely lost. From here, black just keeps chasing the king. Queen takes e4 check, king to f1, queen to h1, king to e2, queen to f3, king to f1. And here, white resigned, because after rook to d2, there's just no defense left against checkmate. Now let's take this one step further, so pay attention. In the next example, I'm going to show you how to turn weak squares into real infiltration points, how to turn your worst piece into your best piece, and most importantly, how to prepare your pieces to attack and punish your opponent. First, let's take a look at the pawn structure. One thing that really stands out here is the c5 square, because none of black's pawns can defend it anymore, and c5 is being controlled by the pawn on d4. So it can be a great outpost for a white piece. For example, a knight on c5 would be incredibly well placed. Once a piece gets to an advanced outpost in enemy territory, it becomes extremely strong, and from there it can start looking for forks in other tactics. And if you're more of a beginner, here's something important to remember. A knight always attacks squares of the opposite color from the one it's sitting on, so be careful about placing your pieces on squares of the same color because they can easily turn into targets. So what else stands out here? Well, the pawn on d4 is technically a weak point for white, but for now it's very well defended. The pawn on b3 is something you definitely have to keep an eye on. It's under attack and the queen is basically stuck defending it. There are also some weak squares on the king side, although the bishop on g7 is still holding things together for the moment. But that's the thing, whenever you play g6, you always end up weakening the squares around your king. So that's pretty much what we can say about the pawn structure here. Now let's look at the pieces. Which piece isn't well placed in white's position? The bishop on e3 is fine, it's defending d4, and it's hard to imagine a better square for it. The bishop on e2 is also doing its job, attacking b5. But the knight on f3 isn't doing so well. You can easily imagine better squares for it, like c5, the square controlled by the pawn on d4, and the queen also needs some improvement. It's not very active right now, but at the moment it's stuck defending b3, and the rooks still aren't connected. Now, if we look at black's position, the bishop on g7 is very passive. The pawn on e5 really restricts it, and at some point it would be nice to break that structure with pawn to f6. The knight on a5 is stuck on the edge of the board and needs improvement, even though it's attacking b3. The queen is fine on b6, the rooks are connected, and the bishop on d7 could also be activated a bit more. But overall, black's pieces are actually worse for now, especially that bishop on g7. So when you look at piece activity, it's pretty clear that white needs to improve that knight. And now here's the big question. Is black threatening something here? Honestly, it's not so obvious. A move that would make sense is bishop to g4, trading for the knight to remove a defender of d4. But there's nothing urgent coming from black right now, and that means white has time to maneuver calmly. This is something you really need to understand. You always have to look at your opponent's plans. If there's an immediate threat, you have to react right away. But if there isn't, then you can take your time, improve your pieces, and slowly build up your attack. In this position, there's a really powerful maneuvering sequence to improve the knight, starting with knight to e1. The idea is to reroute it to d3 and then to c5, where the knight ends up incredibly well placed. In the game, white played b4, with the idea of going bishop to b5 and trading off that light-squared bishop, which isn't doing a great job on d7. Then came knight to d3, and after bishop to b5, knight to c5 follows, and white successfully accomplishes the main objective of planting the knight on the very strong c5 square. For example, play could continue with bishop takes e2, queen to e2, and now this knight does a lot of things at once. It defends the pawn on b3, it sits on an outpost where it can't be kicked away by pawns, and it becomes extremely strong in the position. On top of that, it's threatening a fork on d7, so black already has an immediate problem to solve, and white can just keep improving the position step by step. Do you see that in both of these positions the goal was strategic? It was all about improving the placement of your pieces. It's not like you just reach a winning position and suddenly there's a combination and your opponent resigns. That's not how chess works. The goal here is positional. You work on improving your pieces little by little, move by move, until you reach a point where your position is so strong that you can finally turn it into something concrete, into a real combination. You know this, it happens all the time. A lot of players grind tactics, do thousands of puzzles, and then they get to a middle game position and think, wait, where's the tactic now? What am I supposed to do here? And that's exactly where positional play comes in. When there's no immediate tactic, you strengthen your position with strategy. You keep improving and improving until the position becomes so dominant that the tactics and combinations start to appear naturally. And this is exactly the kind of understanding that completely changes your middle game. So pay attention here. If you're trying to improve your middle game, you're probably going to like the video that's on the screen right now. In it, I'm going to show you 10 middle game plans that work no matter which opening you play. It's a simple method that saved me from blowing a ton of winning positions. Click now and you'll feel how wins start coming way more often. Because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoy it and learn something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.